I have a complicated relationship with Rings of Power. On one hand, I am too big of a Lord of the Rings fan to not be invested in the show. I've read all of Tolkien's extended text, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, you name it. My apartment is littered with Lord of the Rings memorabilia, and I grew up with this story. It's part of my DNA. On the other hand, the show obviously has problems. Season 1 deviated from the lore quite a bit. They created the character of Halbrand out of thin air just so the audience didn't know who Sauron was. They injected halflings into a story where they're not needed just to create audience familiarity. And they made Galadriel, a character who many people love, very unlikable. So during the last 2 years after season 1 ended, I eagerly awaited season 2, hoping for an improved product compared to what we got in season 1. I'm definitely not one of those people hoping that this show would fail. I want this show to be amazing, and I never stopped thinking that that was possible. Because even though season 1 stumbled quite a bit, there was still a lot to love. The relationship between Elrond and Prince Durin to me was a great example of how to expand on Tolkien's text in the right way. The first stage prologue scene showed me that they can craft a visually epic battle when they need to. And Bear McCreary's score is just bliss to the ears. So I walked away from season 1 cautiously optimistic for the future, hoping they'd improve the show based on valid fan feedback in between the first and second seasons. Then, after almost 2 years, we got our first trailers for season 2. And I could already tell that this season would be more focused on the events that Tolkien actually described in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. Since season 1 dealt a bit too much with storylines that were created specifically for the show, it seemed like season 2 would be focusing on the right things. Sauron's deception in Eregion, the creation of the rings, and the political struggles of Numenor. They even left the Harfoots out of the first trailer, which I don't think was an accident. And I'm happy to say, after watching the 3-episode premiere, that this season is absolutely more focused on the things that matter. The writing is hit or miss, but we'll get to that later. Let's start with Sauron, because I actually really like how they're using him this season. Episode 1 started by giving us answers to a lot of questions that were introduced in the first season. We find out what Sauron's prior relationship with Adar was like, and we see a brutal scene where Sauron gets stabbed to death, quote unquote, after trying to take charge of Adar's forces. He then turns into the Venom symbiote and slips away from the scene. We then learn why he takes the form of a man, and I liked the reasoning. He simply did it because it helped him blend in with the first group of people that he saw. And he uses his newfound form to join a crew of people that are sailing west for either Valinor or Numenor, it isn't specified. Now, I don't think that Sauron actually believed that these men would make it to somewhere like Valinor, but I think that he was just going along for the ride because he believed in himself to make it the rest of the way. If Sauron made it to Valinor, that could bring way more consequences than anything else he could do in Middle-earth. So, for me, I like that him taking a human form had a purpose. Even though it was retroactive, it makes the show feel more intentional, and that the Halbrand character wasn't just a bait and switch for the audience. But the best part of this premiere is when things get back to present day, and Sauron walks back into Adar's domain and convinces Adar to trust him. Because this is when the arc of the season truly starts, when Sauron begins his deception on the elves of Eregion. This is one of the most crucial parts of Tolkien's Second Age story, and it's something that most fans thought would play out more in season 1. But I'm happy to say that it's being done really well, better than I even could have hoped, actually. When we move over to episode 2, Halbrand has returned to Eregion. He's waiting to hear from Celebrimbor, who's rejecting his presence because Galadriel said to no longer treat with Halbrand. However, once Celebrimbor finally comes out to address him, Sauron cleverly weasels his way back into Celebrimbor's good graces. He makes it seem like Galadriel is the one that sent him to Eregion, and if Celebrimbor had been speaking with her, she would have told him this already. This pulls on the ego of Celebrimbor, who hasn't been in communication with the elves from Lindon, mainly because Adar's forces intercepted their message. But it works all the same, and that scene is actually very well written, along with most of the Sauron scenes from this season. I think the writing in this show is pretty easy to criticize. Just wait till we get to episode 3. But I have to give credit where it's due. Once Celebrimbor opens the door for Sauron, his plans unfold, and he tells Celebrimbor that he's seeking to make rings for the race of men. He says that he's a messenger for the Valar, and he was sent to intervene and help each race through their respective struggles. And he convinces Celebrimbor of his legitimacy when he transforms from a man into a Maiar right in front of his eyes. And this is what I love about the way that the show is handling Sauron this season. They didn't simply have Sauron walk into Eregion in elven form like Clark Kent and have no one recognize him. They made Celebrimbor's acceptance of Halbrand and Anatar a character choice. A choice that will spiral and avalanche and lead to some serious consequences. I love that Celebrimbor is knowingly doing something wrong. And further than that, doing something wrong that makes sense for his character. We learned last season that he lives in the shadow of his grandfather Feanor. And back in the First Age, Feanor created the Silmarils, which are some of the most important artifacts in all of Tolkien's mythology. It makes complete sense that he would want to create something of equal value to the world. And Anatar is giving him that opportunity. But this leads me to the second point that I want to talk about. consequences. Like I said, the decision to have Celebrimbor trust Annatar will undoubtedly have some major consequences. But we also got to see Galadriel a bit humbled during this 3-episode premiere. During the last season, Galadriel defied the rulings of King Gil-galad and was operating on her own. This made her a very unlikable character, which I believe was an intentional choice by the showrunners, but we all as a collective audience wanted to see her reprimanded for those actions. And I'm happy to say that in season 2, she does get what's coming to her. Kind of. Gil-galad lectures her on how she is semi-responsible for bringing this evil back into the world. And he will not grant her request to go after Sauron unless Elrond joins her. And Elrond is just not having it. Despite multiple attempts to convince him, Galadriel finds no success. It was nice in these moments to see Galadriel get hit with roadblocks. Things were too convenient for her last season. Stumbling upon Sauron, getting picked up by the Númenóreans, and convincing them to join her cause. And even though she is eventually granted permission to go seek out Celebrimbor because they haven't heard back from him, it's under the sole condition that Elrond leads the party, not her. And I think this was a noble attempt by the showrunners to set her back a bit. Elrond is obviously the voice of reason in this show, and maybe some time with him will do her good to help realize the error of her ways. But I can't wholeheartedly say that the way that they've handled Galadriel this season makes total sense. While it was nice to see her get reprimanded a bit, I think they should have taken this much further. The fact that after everything that she did, she is still granted one of the Rings of Power is baffling to me. I know that within the lore she has one, which is why they did it, but in this world that the showrunners have created, I just don't buy Gil-galad ever allowing Galadriel to have one this soon. I feel like she should have had to earn her ring, put in real work to win back Gil-galad's trust over the course of a season or two. That scene where she, Círdan, and Gil-galad put on the rings just feels so random. The audience barely knows Círdan at this point, and he just walks into the ceremony with the bag of rings and no one questions the fact that he puts one on. We are left way too in the dark about the political structure within Lindon, and I feel like these are decisions that needed to be explained. Sure, Galadriel is the commander of the northern armies, but is there a commander of the southern armies? Why didn't they get a ring? It just feels like Galadriel got a ring because she's the main character of the show, and that is not a good enough reason for me. In the grand scheme of things, it does irk me a bit, but it's not the end of the world. It's lore accurate, and maybe it provides an opportunity for her to prove to the viewer that she deserves it. But this to me was a warning sign. A sign that even though a lot of things have been fixed this season, some of those old problems still remain. And never was that more apparent to me than in episode 3. If I had to give each episode a number score, I'd probably give episode number 1 an 8. I'd give episode 2 a 9 or even 10 maybe because of just how much I loved what they did with Sauron, but I'd probably give episode number 3 a 4 or a 5. And the main source of frustration within this episode was the writing. I just knew things were going to be different this episode when Isildur's horse goes Super Saiyan mode and kicks an orc through a wooden post. But in all seriousness, there are problems within Númenor, and I don't mean in the plot. Continuing my last point, it just doesn't seem like the writers capture political intricacies well, because I think Númenor is inherently being mishandled due to a lack of planning and the ability to write its story effectively. And to explain this, I want to dive into the lore of Númenor before the events of the show. Tolkien wrote that Númenor thrived as a paradise for mankind for over 1,000 years. And the story in the show is obviously depicting the era in which they fall from grace. But we as the audience never really saw its heyday. People who haven't read Tolkien's stories about Númenor don't know its history, and they're confronted with a very different version of that city in the show. Because from the get-go, Númenor is in strife within all of Season 1. The day that Galadriel shows up immediately causes problems. Problems that we as the audience don't understand very well, because they were told to us through exposition instead of being shown to us through other means of storytelling. And the way that these problems are dealt with in the show are almost always in extremes. Like when Kemen tries to burn down all of the Númenorian ships in Season 1 so that they can't sail to Middle-earth. This is an action that could have felt earned if the audience had more context for the years of racial tension between the elves and the men of Númenor. But because this problem springs up so suddenly, these actions feel rash and unjustified. And unfortunately in Season 2, we get more of the same. During the previous king's funeral, the first scene we get back in Númenor this season, some random citizen walks up to Queen Miriel and slaps her in the face in front of an entire crowd. And the reason why is because there were only shells available for the people to grab. And this woman got mad because she thinks that that's all Miriel has to offer as respect for the fallen. Like, the lack of subtlety is unbearable. I literally laughed out loud when I saw that. And it doesn't end there. Every scene in Númenor just has some element to it that doesn't feel quite right. The way that people interact in Númenor is just not how real people act. It really makes you question how Númenor got to be as powerful as they are if this is how they conduct themselves. Later on, Barristan talks to some politician at like a local pub. And Arianne speaks about how she may have found a way for Pharazôn to stake his claim, hinting at how she found the Palantir at the end of last season. And just as the plot is beginning to move along, Isildur's friend who fought alongside Míriel in battle last season comes over to their table to argue because he thinks that they're slandering Miriel's name. He and Kemen have this heated back and forth sitting beside the country's literal most important political figures. And again, any subtlety that could have come from this conversation was lost. The writers desperately want to spell out that one side is right and that the other side is wrong. A stance that is already painfully obvious in the show. Simple conversations are not enough in Numenor. There always needs to be some exclamation point. And finally, later in the episode, Míriel is getting ready for her coronation. And once again, the writers try to beat you over the head with the fact that Míriel is a more traditional leader, and Pharazôn is taking a more progressive approach based on the literal outfits that she's planning to wear. Pharazôn has to say it out loud. Nothing can be left to the imagination. And it all eclipses during the coronation when someone calls Míriel the Queen of Lies. And I don't inherently have a problem with this type of revolt in Numenor. It has to happen to progress the story. But it just seems like there can't be an interaction in Numenor without conflict breaking out in the biggest way possible. Arianne then decides to speak out against Míriel, against her father's wishes, and she unveils the Palantir. And she says that Míriel trusts in ancient elven artifacts. And then, when Pharazôn calls for it to be destroyed, Míriel, in my favorite move yet, just says, "No, it's mine, we need it," without explaining herself any further. The Numenor storyline desperately needs nuance. When all of the Numenorians are mad about something that the audience doesn't think is justified, then there's something wrong. Make it so that we don't know which side of the argument is right. Both sides need to have some valid rationale for any tension to exist. And if the show is holding the audience's hand telling them who to root for, then any attempted emotional moments like this will always fall flat. And I hate to compare the show to House of the Dragon, but just look at Rhaenyra and Alicent. You know every single factor that goes into the decisions they make. You know their motivations, you know what they have to gain, and you know what they have to lose. In Numenor, everything feels surface level, like we haven't gone deep enough. I can only hope that this changes with time, but when I saw this episode and realized that the same problems from season 1 had carried over to season 2, that got me worried. And it also didn't help that in this episode, we spent more time with Isildur and Theo, two characters that haven't been very enjoyable to watch thus far. I'm happy that we finally got Arondir back though, because he's one of my absolute favorite parts of the show. But having said all of this, I'm still happy that Numenor is being prioritized as central to the show. Like I said earlier, the showrunners are focused on the right things this season. And even more extraneous plot lines, like the one for the Harfoots and the Stranger, seem to be more interesting this season. So I'm actually in a similar state to where I was before I had seen these 3 episodes. Back then, I was hoping for something new and improved. And I genuinely feel like we got that. I know I've been dragging the Númenórean storyline for the past few minutes, but I do view the first 2 episodes as a noticed improvement over season 1. It actually makes me wonder why they did a 3-episode premiere instead of 2. The first 2 episodes really start and finish the Halbrand turning into Annatar arc. And I feel like that would have been the perfect little appetizer to get fans excited for the rest of the season. But instead, my viewing experience ended on a bit more sour of a note. And while I can recognize that the good elements from season 1 got even better, I think that the bad elements got worse. But I am forever the optimist, and I will be continuing to watch the show. Because on the whole, I know that the showrunners love this world, and they're doing their best to give us something truly special. And if those moments only shine through part of the time, then it's still better to experience them than to close your eyes to them entirely. As I look forward to the next 5 episodes, I'm genuinely excited to see how Sauron continues his deception in Eregion. And the oncoming battle that they've teased in literally every single trailer looks like an astounding step up from the battle in the Southlands that we got last season. I would be very happy with a full episode-long battle, akin to what we've seen on screen in Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith. I really want it to live up to that. But what do you think? Do you think this season started off better than season 1? Do you think it's more of the same? I'd love to see some comments from those of you who enjoyed your experience, because I think the conversation around this show needs more positivity. And if you do have negative things to say, please try to be constructive. Back up why you don't like it, and don't just spew negativity for the sake of it. Please like, comment, and subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good one.